Well, you know, it's happened again with the sermon. I had a very nice, middle-of-the-road, stitch-it-onto-a-throw-pillow kind of sermon about the Beatitudes, you know, the blessings of Jesus. You've probably heard a lot of those, right? There's very nice, middle-of-the-road, don't challenge anybody. Yet there I was last night with my well-worn Bible. I have a really well-worn one, a heavy one at home, but a Bible and an extra hour. It's never a good thing for me, have an extra hour to think. And I realized that it was no accident that the Beatitudes from the Gospel of Luke were chosen for All Saints Sunday. So there's a time-honored story about a man who walked into a bookstore to return a purchase. This will give you some insight into where I'm going with this. And he handed the book to the clerk at the cash register, and he said, "It's a Bible." This was back when you could, take books back to real bookstores, right? He said, "It's a Bible." And the clerk says, was it a gift? And the man said, "No, I bought it for myself, but I made a mistake." And the clerk said, "Well, didn't you like the translation or the format?" And he said, "No, the format was clear and the translation was fine. I just made a mistake." And the clerk said, "Well, I have to write down a reason for the return to give you your money back." And the man said, "Well, in that case, write down that there is just a lot in this book that is tough to swallow." Well-worn story. And today's lesson from the Gospel of Luke, you may not know this, may be one of the toughest lessons of all to swallow in our society today. A great theologian named Paul Tillich once noted that students of the New Testament often find it is not the refined arguments of Paul and all of the epistles or the mystical wisdom of the Gospel of John, but it is the simple sayings of Jesus that are often the most difficult to interpret today. And Luke's version of the Beatitudes is even tougher to swallow than the Beatitudes that are in Matthew. And our Route 66 folks know, we studied this year, the Beatitudes are in Matthew and in Luke. And at first glance, when you study the passage this afternoon, if you know what Matthew wrote, you might think, well, Luke is just presenting a scaled-down version of that lofty Sermon on the Mount that Matthew had, which appears in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. But there are some significant differences that impact our message today. For example, if we turn to the Gospel of Matthew, some of you have Bibles, some of you don't. There are also Bibles that are in your pews. I encourage you, if you don't have a Bible, let me know. We'll get you one. If you don't know how to find stuff in the Bible, just let us know. We'll show you how. But if you turn to the Gospel of Matthew, and actually now a lot of you can get it on your phone, you can just say Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, and it will pop up for no cost. Well, that's relatively speaking. If you do the Gospel of Matthew on your phone or in the book, chapter 5, we read in verses 1 through 2, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain and then he began to speak. But in the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 6, verse 17, we see today, he came down with them and stood on a level place. So just that simple difference. In Luke, Jesus goes up on the mountain, in Matthew, and in Luke, Jesus comes down on the plain to be with the people. And the location of Jesus in sharing this message is reflected in the content. And you basically have the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, which most people are really familiar with, and the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, which some folks are not quite as familiar with. Matthew, if you're not familiar with the differences between Matthew and Luke, Matthew seems to spiritualize Jesus' message. You might remember that Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." But in Luke, we simply read today, "Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry now." The teachings up on the mountain are more abstract. Like blessed are the poor in spirit. But down in the valley, on the plain, where real people live, we understand the meaning in our gut of what it means to be hungry, of what it means to be poor. We see it every week here at the largest table as hundreds are fed, often their only hot meal of the day, through the kitchen. We see it in the 1 in 6 children in Franklin County and throughout our Ohio communities who do not have enough food to eat every day. They are what's called food insecure. We have people doing GoFundMe pages to pay off school lunch debt because kids are being prohibited from participating in activities because they have school lunch debt. So they either don't get their lunch or they don't get their activity. How cruel have we become to even let that happen? So, in addition to the difference in the two Gospels between the location of the message and where it's delivered, the mountain versus the plain, we see in Luke's Beatitudes that Jesus is flatly literal. I've learned in my life that sometimes you have to be just literal with people. I always say that, my husband's an engineer. You got to be literal for him to get it. Got to be literal. If it's really abstract, he's like, I feel feelings and abstractions. Just tell me, if you're hungry, great, I'll get food for people. And that's what Jesus was doing. There is none of the lofty spiritualizing in Luke that you find in Matthew. So despite what you may have learned about the Beatitudes when you were a child, these are not the be happy attitudes. Sometimes we're taught that these are the be happy attitudes, and that's not the case. Instead, what we see in this scripture is that the blessings and woes in Luke offer us a foundation for the kind of upside-down holy living that is celebrated on All Saints Sunday. We have to remember that in the time of Jesus' land was ruled by wealthy men like Herod and Caiaphas, cruel kings who ruled the land, the airwaves, and the people. Kings who were aided by hierarchical religious leaders who prayed over the kings in public and maybe even for the equivalent of photo ops back then, and then ranked the remaining people by family connection and ancestry, gender and class, and by the weight of one's pocketbook. These cruel leaders in Jesus' time used fear and threats like today's constant tweets that keep everyone on edge and trigger reactiveness throughout our country. These cruel leaders used fear and threats to persuade the people that some people were better than others, some were more worthy than others, some were more blessed by God than others. But Jesus turned this concept of blessing upside down in Luke. Instead of pronouncing the rich, the powerful, and the war makers as blessed, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor, the meek, the peacemakers, the refugees, people like the huddled masses yearning to be free and crossing borders." And not only that, Jesus isn't just describing something in the Beatitudes, he is performing something. And that's the subtle distinction that we catch in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is not just describing blessed people. He is actually performing a blessing on the people that he is describing and in connection with in that text. He is saying, those of you who have lost hope, God bless you. You are beloved. Jesus isn't telling us how to be blessed with the Beatitudes. He is blessing those who have never been blessed. That's a really subtle distinction. He blesses people who have never been blessed in this text. So I want to tell you a contemporary and true story about the power of blessing someone. This year we have used material from Reverend Nadia Bowles-Weber because she was a pastor in Denver, Colorado. She's become a prominent and provocative public theologian, author, and speaker. She published a second book this last year, and she also has done a number of video series about contemporary theology. But you may not know that Nadia grew up in a very conservative church. There were a lot of rules. No smoking, no drinking, no dancing. Girls and boys couldn't even be in the swimming pool at the same time. There were no musical instruments in church, and there were absolutely no women pastors. Well, as Nadia grew up, and she's about my age, when she grew up, she grew tired of all of the restrictive rules, and she rebelled. She got tattoos, and she became an alcoholic. She experimented with drugs and sex and other self-destructive behaviors that put her and others at risk. But eventually, Nadia got clean and sober. And she realized, deep in her heart, she realized she had a calling to be a pastor for her people. And her people were the ones that she would describe as the people who had tattoos, people who were told they couldn't serve or be in church because they had tattoos, or their earrings were too big, or they wore too much makeup, or their skirts were too short, or whatever it was. The people who often didn't feel welcomed in church because they either lived at the margins of society or they began to question why society wasn't working for them. So Nadia decided to go to seminary. She was older, but she decided to go to seminary, and first she had to tell her parents. She loved her parents, but she knew she had to tell them, and she was scared. And she wrote this in her first book, how profound this was. She was scared to death to tell her parents that she was going to confront them and go to seminary and become a female pastor. She was afraid her parents might shame her and throw Bible verses at her about how women couldn't be pastors. But she gathered up her courage and she told them her plans. And as soon as she did, her father stood up and he grabbed his Bible and he opened it to the book of Esther. I encourage you to read that book this afternoon if you have time. If you don't know, Esther is a Jewish woman who knows she is supposed to do this thing for God, but she is scared and doesn't know if she can do it. And as Nadia's father read this part of the story in the book of Esther, he paused on this verse. The verse is, "You were born for such a time as this." You were born for such a time as this. Particularly appropriate on this Sunday where we're all focused on time and setting our clocks and making sure our car thing works and the video thing works and all the things that we have trouble setting our clocks for, and we don't realize that the most important part of time is figuring out what we were called to do, what we were born to do. And her father said, "You were born for such a time as this." And then Nadia's father closed the Bible and he prayed a blessing on his daughter. He did not follow the dictates and tenets of his church that said that he had to reject her and turn her out. He prayed a blessing instead on his daughter. And Nadia says about that moment, you need a blessing to go and do what you're going to do and to be who God is calling you to be. And sometimes you can't do that unless someone blesses you. And Nadia, continuing in her book, she said, the fact that my blessing came from my very conservative Church of Christ, not United Church of Christ, but Church of Christ parents, she said, it's one of the most profound gifts of my lifetime. And I share Pastor Nadia's story with you today because we here at St. John's need a blessing to go and do what we're supposed to do in this world and to be who God is calling us to be. Because our country is very rapidly becoming a scary place, if it wasn't already. And we people of faith are being called to take a stand about what we follow and who we follow. So, when you come forward later in the service for communion, I will have something for you. It's called a blessing card. We've used these periodically before, but it's a reminder, something that you can take with you to remind you that you are blessed. It says, go be love. The world needs you. It's something to remind you that you are blessed and you are called because the world needs you. We can no longer afford to be complacent in our faith and in our practice. The world needs each of you to be who God is calling you to be. And if you're not sure if you are indeed blessed, just take a minute and see what Reverend Nadia has to say.
Blessed are the agnostics. Blessed are they who doubt, those who aren't sure, those who can still be surprised. Blessed are those who have nothing to offer. Blessed are they for whom death is not an abstraction. Blessed are they who've buried their loved ones, for whom tears could fill an ocean. Blessed are they who've loved enough to know what loss feels like. Blessed are they who don't have the luxury of taking things for granted anymore. Blessed are they who can't fall apart because they have to keep it together for everyone else. Blessed are those who still aren't over it yet. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who no one else notices, the kids who sit alone at middle school lunch tables, the laundry guys at the hospital, the sex workers and the night shift street sweepers. Blessed are the forgotten. Blessed are the closeted. Blessed are the unemployed, the unimpressive, the underrepresented. Blessed are the wrongly accused, the ones who never catch a break, the ones for whom life is hard, for Jesus chose to surround himself with people like them. Blessed are those without documentation. Blessed are the ones without lobbyists. Blessed are those who make terrible business decisions for the sake of people. Blessed are the burned out social workers and the overworked teachers and the pro bono case takers. Blessed are the kind-hearted NFL players and the fundraising trophy wives. And blessed are the kids who step between the bullies and the weak. Blessed is everyone who has ever forgiven me when I didn't deserve it. Blessed are the merciful, for they totally get it. You are of heaven, and Jesus blesses you.
Some of you are in tears right now. I can't help but see that and be moved. Because Jesus blesses you, and there is nothing you cannot do to which you have been called. If you need a blessing today, if you don't feel like this sermon quite did the trick, I'm going to have the blessing card for you, and then I am going to offer you a blessing at communion. Just God bless you and keep you on your forehead. I'm going to invite the other pastors who are members of this congregation to join me in offering that blessing to other people, so that each of you might know that there is nothing in this world that you cannot do to which you have been called. Thanks be to God. Amen.